Mamy dowody. Jasne, czy nie? Czy jakieś inne propozycje? Dowody. Dowody już mamy.
Potwierdzenie.
Thank you. So I'm very happy to be back in Poland again, and also very happy to see friends and familiar faces in the audience. In the US group that I brought this time, we struggle with this word expert. In English, it implies I know everything about the topic, and I do not pretend to know everything about anything. And in fact, one of the best things for me in my professional life in coming to Poland and in working with Polish educators in the United States is that my understanding keeps changing about lots of things. I learn a lot about what goes on in Poland, but perhaps even more, I learn about the assumptions I have about schools in the United States. And for a few years now, I have liked starting a session, especially a workshop, with a task like this. Because it is quite possible by the time that we're finished that you will want to put different Polish words on the right-hand side. And I have to tell you, if I was in the United States and we were having the same list of English words, no one would agree what they mean. What really is evidence? What does this concept of best practice actually mean? And it has quotes on there because really no one agrees what it means. What does a lesson sequence look like? And how do you adapt lessons for students in classrooms? And my favorite one up here in my work in Poland, this conception in English of borrow, to take something from someone, and lend, to give something back, I don't think your word means quite the same. And rigor, what we might say is high expectations, is also a quite complicated concept. So at the end, we'll see if you want to change any of the Polish words that you've put up there. So if I look at the element of the requirements that I'm going to try and connect to this afternoon, it is 2.3. And in the English translation of this element is quite complex. Educational processes are structured. And in my experience in schools at home, every teacher and every principal would say, my educational process has a structure. And then we would argue whether or not it is the best structure or the most appropriate. But today, related to that element, I want to focus on 3 questions. How do students learn? What teaching practices are generating evidence of improved teaching and learning? And how do we work with teachers to improve their understanding of this concept of best practice? So, no one agrees what actually is going on in a classroom. And some researchers talk about 3 points of time to look at. The first point, what do we prepare teachers to do? How do we teach them? The second point, what do they actually do when they are in the classroom? And the third point, what results do we get as a result of those practices? And there are lots of attempts in different parts of the world right now to connect those 3 points. Train the teacher to do this, they will do this in their classroom, and this result will happen. And this attempt to find connections across those 3 points is a huge struggle. One group of researchers has 4 key elements that they say help us connect those 3 points. The first one is that there are well-conceptualized sequences of lessons going on in the classroom. And in some fields, my colleagues in mathematics would say, especially in theirs, for example, there's lots of research going on about what this sequence must look like. So students start at this particular starting point, and we have to move them to this other point by doing this, this, and this. But the trick here with this one is that the teacher understands what that sequence looks like. And that's not only for the students that are sitting right in front of them, but the students who were working a few years ago and where they're going to be a few years later. And I'm not sure about your teachers, but I can tell you what happens at home. The high school teacher says, the teachers in the middle school did a horrible job, and that's why we're struggling. So some of you know this. The gymnasium teacher says, oh, those primary teachers, that's why our students struggle. And my wife's favorite, the primary teachers say it's the mother's fault before they got to school. And instead, what we're looking for here is that everyone in that sequence understands both their year, the particular weeks they're working on, and the broad spectrum of the sequence of what's happening. The second one is this concept of formative assessment. And we have huge arguments about formative assessment right now in the United States. My favorite is the 3 cups. So imagine we're in a classroom. You each are sitting at your desk, and you have 3 cups sitting on your desk. One is red, one yellow, one green. And I start teaching the lesson, And at a certain point I ask you, okay, if you don't understand what's happening, put your red cup on the top. And if you understand, put your green cup. And if you're not sure, the yellow one. But here's where the problem comes in. If I see a whole pile of red cups, do I understand that it's a natural part of the learning process that a group of students would feel frustrated? And our teachers struggle with, do I stop the lesson and go help those students, or do I keep going? So formative assessment for me is both this gathering of data very quickly from students to see if they're understanding, but also the much more complicated concept of helping the teacher understand at what point do I jump in to try and do something to change what's going on. And again, this research says the teacher has to understand both of those. So I learned from my colleague Grzegorz Mazurkiewicz a few years ago. We were working with a school in Poland, and the question we asked was, do you have data about this particular issue? If you believe something exists in your school, can you actually prove it with the data that you have? So this concept of evidence becomes a struggle. Do you really have evidence of what is actually going on in that school, in that classroom? And the last part of this, again, we have huge fights about it. And this afternoon, I'm not going to go too far into this, but if the only evidence we have is performance on a test, we would have arguments whether or not that is really evidence. So we have lots of examples of concepts that are taught in school. The students do well on the test, but the minute they're out of that test environment, they can't apply that information to a different situation. So by my definition, student learning is that I understand a concept and I can apply it in a new, unique information and setting. And test evidence is not enough to say a particular method I use in my classroom is actually successful. So I will not ask you to share right now what you have come up with, but I will tell you we have arguments about that as well. But if you can imagine, the concept originally came from medicine, at least in our experience in the United States. And I'll tell you a story from my childhood. I went to a dentist, again an older man, slightly grumpy, and as a young child he would work on my teeth and it would always hurt. I moved away to the university and I went to a dentist because I had a problem with a tooth, and he took out a needle and said, I will give you an anesthetic so you don't feel anything. And I was like, wow, dentists use anesthetic? Because my older dentist had just said, oh no, you don't need this. If it hurts too bad, tell me to stop. And the sound of a drill on my teeth still makes me nervous. At some point in the past, not using an anesthetic in a dentist office may have been best practice. It was not really best practice when I was going to the dentist. Every other dentist was using anesthetic. And as dentists learn different things and techniques, research evidence is gathered to see which techniques are improving on the performance of my teeth. So this concept that I'm doing what I have always done isn't good enough. And instead, we expect that teachers and principals and other people involved in schools are paying attention to what's going on in the classroom. What does it look like from day to day in classrooms around the building? You also have this sense that you expect people to come to some agreement about what is good, reputable work. It has a good reputation. And it might mean that it's a new particular method or strategy that someone's using. It comes out of research that has evidence connected to the results. And while it might look like a new method when I first learn it, it has a reputation as being something that's going to be strong and effective. And again, in best practice, teachers and principals in schools are deciding what best practice looks like in their particular niche. So these four elements right here: aware of current research, what the latest knowledge is saying, how technology is changing lots of answers about what happens in a classroom, and what actual procedures or methods a teacher might use. And the third element of best practice is that everyone who's teaching takes in a conception in their head that their job is to figure out the best way to do something. I would describe it as a habit of mind. That as a teacher and a principal, my job is not just to conduct the lesson, but to be aware of how it's working. And then maybe reading the research about that strategy or that concept. And then trying something a little different in my classroom. And engaging in this inquiry to find the best way with the best and strongest effect. All right, so, two very big warnings. And it goes to this word evidence. In the United States right now, we have approximately 4 big groups arguing with each other. And there are some common elements that come across all of them, but they also interpret research evidence in slightly different ways. And part of it, again, is that definition of evidence. Is it the test score or something else? Is it the test score, or is it what the student does at the next level of school? Is it the test score, or what they do when they graduate and go off into real life? Or is it some combination of all of that? So this group, when they look at the evidence, have a list of things that they believe are best practice in a classroom. It's interesting to me that some of them are things I have been seeing in Poland for a long time. And some of them are also in your elements of school evaluation. So in the first one, that there's evidence of collaboration between teachers and also collaboration between teachers and students. The second one, evidence of active teaching, and the students are engaged in what they're doing. The third one, that there's modeling on the part of the teacher, not just instructions to go do something and figure it out on your own. The next one, we have lots of arguments about, but this concept of authentic teaching and learning, and also experiential, that I feel things. And the last one, that I build time in for reflection in the classroom and in the activities that I'm doing. And the phrase they use from the research is metacognition. And that you work with the students for them to think about what they are actually learning and how they're learning it. But broadly, their particular work is reflected in these things that they look for when they're going into classrooms. Authentic, student-centered, democratic practices, rigor and high expectations, and other things. A different group would define it slightly different. And I know there are a few people connected to the Center for Citizenship Education in Warsaw who are in the audience, and they have just helped publish a translation of Marzano's work. And in the United States, Marzano was involved with a group of authors, some of who are reflected up here, and they have taken some of their initial work, and this is their newest edition that just got published in the United States. And again, you'll hear some similar things to what we just read about best practice. So strong learning environments have to be present. The teacher sets objectives, provides feedback. Lots of different forms of cooperative learning going on between partners and triads and groups. Strong questioning techniques on the part of the teacher. Multiple ways that information is presented in graphs and images and text and narrative. And then again, that the students not only learn the information, but have to apply it into new situations. But lots of debates about what this looks like in the classroom. So if I take the list of best practice criteria, can I walk into someone's room and what would it look like? How long would I have to be in that teacher's classroom to be able to say, ah, that's best practice? If I was looking at classroom instruction strategies that are working, what would it actually look like in the classroom? What would I need to see? So I have a few questions of you. I would like you to hold up your fingers for how many minutes I have to go into the classroom before I can decide if it's best practice. And I know people, principals, who will say they can walk in the door and they know the minute they walk in. And some who disagree with that. So how many minutes? I have you back. And 4, 3, and I see a few people. 10. In 10 minutes you will know. Yeah. So the second question, does it matter what part of the lesson you walk in the door? So if I show up at the beginning, do I know more than if I show up at the end? If you think the beginning, put your right hand up. Put your hand up. If you think I have to show up at the end, put your hand up. And I have some principals who would say I have to show up at scattered different times over the course of a couple of weeks. You have to decide. Third question, third question. Do you need to know anything from me before you see my lesson? So I have a colleague who is a principal at a school, and he will call up Eva the night before. Eva, I'm coming to your class tomorrow to see science. What time should I be there? And can you tell me a little bit about this lesson? Where is it in the sequence of things that are going on? Eva, when she gets off the phone, says, oh crap. But this particular principal believes that by asking the questions, he knows right away what Eva is thinking she's going to do tomorrow. Now, for sure, I know other principals who do not want the teacher to know ahead of time. So if you want to know something about the lesson, can you raise your hand and ask me a question? What do you want to know about my lesson? Yes? Question?
Jakie są najważniejsze cele?
So what are the main goals?
The main goals. So my students are struggling with the concept of multiplication. And I tried a few activities and they didn't work, so now I will try to use some objects to help them. Yes?
Ja bym zapytała, czy są uczniowie w klasie wymagający szczególnej uwagi, uczniowie z trudnościami bądź wyjątkowo zdolni.
Are there any students that require special attention, especially gifted, or the other way?
So this particular class is full of students who English is their second language. Most of them are the children of Mexican immigrants. But I have been working very hard in both English and in the content areas to help them understand what we're doing. And I believe some of them are quite gifted.
How big is it?
My class has about 25 students. So I want them, by the end of the lesson, to be able to manipulate objects that model the particular mathematic function that I'm doing. And they're very young, by the way, no one's asked. Okay, so we will test you now. You have what you want to look for. We're going to watch. I'm going to try and talk and he'll translate what's going on. I'm going to show you a problem-solving strategy.
Okay, how many groups do I have here?
Group times the number will give me the answer, the young child has said. Group times the number, again, the teacher says. Best practice or not? Talk to the person next to you. Again, talk to each other, best practice or not. And what criteria and evidence do you need or have already? Uwaga. It is always fun being the session after lunch, so I will make you move. And this will be an interesting experience right now. You have three choices. You believe there is evidence of best practice in this classroom, move up front. No evidence of best practice, move back in the corner. And you're just a little not sure and there's more you would like to know, here in the middle. When you get to your group, I want you to listen. I have a task for you. All right, so we will change it a bit, but I want you to notice, no one is in the back corner. So everyone thinks something's going on in this room. So this big group in the middle, every group of principals I ever talk to wants more evidence. They want to come back again and again and again before they're willing to make a decision is it best practice or not. So if you can divide into smaller groups of 4 or 5, what evidence would you want to still see in this classroom? And for this group, if you can talk as one group, what made it good enough, but what could make it better? All right, Uwaga. If I'm the teacher, what do you want to know from me on the phone call the night before?
Uczniowie już pracowali kiedyś metodą projektów, albo w ogóle czy umieją już pracować w grupach, czy tylko indywidualnie?
Great. So the classroom that you're going to see, I'm working on providing intervention to small groups of students off to the side of the room, while other students are working independently.
Ale jakie są cele tej lekcji?
I am collecting assessment data on independent reading. And in my particular classroom, I've been trying to collect formative assessment data over time. But I have a struggle, and that struggle is how I listen and record data at the same time. And I went to a workshop about scoring students who are reading. So don't be too hard on me because I'm still trying to figure out how to do it. I asked a student a question, words that describe the word dog. What do you think is going on in the picture? What is the little boy doing or girl doing over here? What's that word? Talk to the person next to you. Evidence of best practice or not? There is no middle this time. Either to the back, not best practice, or to the front, good enough, best practice. What evidence do you have that it's best practice? What evidence of no best practice? Use the criteria that you made a list of. Lots of what we're doing in our classrooms we do because of the assumptions we bring to the context. And as school leaders, we have to figure out, what does my context need? What data can I gather to see whether or not I'm being successful? And what things should I try out to see if I can improve? And again, I don't believe we're ever going to get to a final list. So there's an educational researcher who does a lot of work in the South Pacific and in Australia, Indonesia, and places like that. And he says educational research or educational science should not be attempting to eliminate all the differences around the world. And that in fact, this unique bubbling up of new ideas and new methods is what's going to keep making education better. And that doesn't mean we don't borrow ideas from other places, or say when we encounter some stranger from the United States, I have an idea from Poland that might work in your school. But it does mean that I value difference as well. Ultimately, I believe the best schools are those that are consciously engaging in inquiry in their classrooms, that are bringing groups of teachers together to think about what's happening in their room. And the thing I really like about the two videos Both of those teachers were part of small lesson study groups. They were meeting with other groups of teachers in their school. They were identifying topics that they were struggling with in their particular classroom, looking for new methods that might work better. And then in our context, the biggest thing, allowing a video camera to come in and observe them doing it, to share with other colleagues. So imagine the cultural difference of what we did. If that was a teacher in your school, and you were my colleagues in that school, what would you have said to me? Which corner of the room would you have moved to? And how would you want me to improve? And when we train teachers on lesson study, we start with an anonymous person, but then very quickly move to figuring out a way that we can talk to each other about what we're doing in our classroom. And I believe the best evidence of success comes out of those conversations. So our list of evidence, best practice, learning sequence, adaptive, borrow, lend, and rigor. I'm not sure if the Polish words mean exactly what I intended them to, but I believe you have to figure out what is best practice for you. And thank you.